Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, Jonathan Steele. Tonight on the programme we'll be looking at Jordan's role in the alliance against the Islamist group IS and other stories making the headlines today. But first, Home Secretary Theresa May at the Conservative conference today unveiled a new set of measures which will give new powers to judges to ban speakers and organisations thought to endorse an extremist ideology. Yasmin Khatun has more on this story.
As the Conservative Party conference continues here in Britain, Theresa May has set out plans for a new counter-terrorism strategy. This comes amidst a global crackdown from Australia to Britain as governing bodies clamp down on what they call extremist activity. The changing dynamic of IS and the role of foreign fighters has led to an increased worry of what sympathisers might do in their hometowns and the influence they may have on their communities. But the new measures seem to propose a much harder line than we've seen previously, and one that challenges any semblance of political Islam.
Two questions he's not put to himself.
In the new set of proposals, there will be restrictions banning individuals from speaking at public events, protests and meetings, with the authority also set to ban individuals from public locations. Restrictions on public appearances, including television, and restrictions on use of social media and the internet for those accused of being extreme have also been included. The proposals also include measures to ban those who might come under non-violent extremist groups working for the purpose of overthrowing democracy. For groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, this could have major implications. The strategy is based on proposals that came out of David Cameron's Extremism Working Party, set up following the murder of Fusilier Lee Rigby in May last year. He was killed by two men on the streets of London, citing British foreign activities as their reason. It also comes as a long-anticipated report on the Muslim Brotherhood and its activities here in Britain is set to be released. Britain isn't alone in counter-terror measures, and earlier today Australian police raided homes in Melbourne after weeks of similar operations after the terror alert was raised to high.
Certainly the community continue to have confidence that we'll be monitoring what's happening in the community in relation to our terrorism investigations and terrorism related activity, and that will certainly be acting sooner than later if we do detect any particular threat emerging.
My dear Muslims, we are here today to ask you...
The implications of the proposed measures cannot be judged before they've been seen, but both in Australia and Britain, many have expressed concern. The ideas and proposals being made add to the draconian nature of enforcement, seemingly set to target and curb a single community.
Welcome. Thank you, sir. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Speaking in Istanbul last night, Muslim Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke about international terrorism and world security, saying that everyone is talking about the consequences, but no one is addressing the causes. Erdogan said he wondered why his European friends were not concerned about the terrorist organisation, the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, asking, is it because this organisation has no relation to Islam? With political Islam coming under attack once again, the sentiment is one shared by many. But the question we're left with is, will these measures tackle the root causes of the issue, or will they continue to slice the froth? Yasmin Khatun, The Report.
Well, joining me in the studio to discuss this is Naila Abdel-Khalek from human rights advocacy group CAGE and Talha Ahmad, who's a spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain. And on Skype, we're joined by Margaret Gilmore, who is a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Service Institute. Welcome to you all. Let me start with you, Talha. I mean, how much is this discrimination against political Islam, do you think?
When I read Theresa May's speech, I thought the first paragraph was so encouraging because she spoke about the experience and how devastating it would be if you are stopped and searched simply because of your color or faith. And yet, as you progressed, I was horrified because I thought that a government which was preaching only recently that we should be, Muslim community should adopt and accept and live in peace with British values, and yet everything she was talking about was contrary to British values. What these measures seems to be seeking to achieve is to deny any space to people who express a different point of view to the prevailing political discourse, if you like, and if that view is inspired by Islam. So I'm extremely concerned. Fortunately, it's at their party conference, and hopefully it will not become a government policy. But it does concern me a huge lot, the narrative and the rhetoric that we have heard today.
Well, Naila, I mean, there are people who have quite an extreme ideology and are pushing it in mosques and things. I mean, what should be done about those people?
Well, I mean, by silencing these voices, it's only making them more important to the Muslim community. So surely if you want to have open debate and to discuss issues that are really crucial to Muslims and young Muslim youth, it's very important to have these debates in open. Otherwise, you're going to force them underground, and they're going to be, you know, there's no open debate, there's no cause to bring alternative views, to bring perhaps maybe the true, you know, message that you want to get to these youth. If you push them underground, you're not going to do that.
Margaret Gilmore, I mean, do you think that the balance between free speech and restriction on extremism has now been crossed and they've virtually given up on free speech?
No, it hasn't, because we've got free speech and we're chatting away here. But I think there is a lot of political rhetoric in what Theresa May was saying. A lot of the things she's described, actually we have laws which already do those things anyway. ASBOs, the old-fashioned banning orders, stopping people from going to specific places, have actually been used against supporters, for example, of Anjem Choudhury in the past couple of years, to stop them turning up at places. There have been other laws that we've got on inciting religious and racial hatred. So in a way, I see a new name for something that already exists. On the other hand, I think one of the things she was suggesting is more powers to tackle what's going on the internet. I think that is very important. And I think you're absolutely right to raise this problem of what do we do in a society where we all want to live happily together, and yet there's this tiny little element who's coming in here, who's driving a large part of the British population bonkers because they're so angry that they see these people come in and we pay our taxes, we have our schools, we have our health service, and they're happy to share that, and then they want to bomb us. That is a perception of this tiny, tiny, tiny little group of people. And that's what's got to be tackled. In a way, it'd be lovely if we could just tear it all up and start talking and sort it from scratch, but we can't.
Aren't there already laws against incitement to racial hatred or to hatred of any kind? I mean, so why not wait till somebody does something and then go after them rather than ban people before they've even opened their mouths?
Well, I think people will have already opened their mouths by the time they're banned. But I totally agree with you. Some of these things that she's talking about, I just think they are in place already. The laws already exist. She's just giving them a different kind of name. And some of these laws have already been used against the people she's trying to go to. I think what they're looking for is people who are who have been, say, using the internet, saying some very outrageous things, and then they would be banned. You can't ban somebody before they've said anything.
Well,
but I think
it's civil orders, so the burden of proof is much lower than, you know, its criminal counterpart. It's, you know, these will be granted, the police can go to a judge and they'll be granted fairly easily on the balance of probabilities as opposed to beyond reasonable doubt. And so that's a huge concern that, yes, it is similar to powers we already have, which would beg the question, why do we need these at all? If we've already got legislation, as with all terror legislation, there's a criminal legal framework that we should be looking to first and foremost. We shouldn't be bringing in new legislation on new powers, new policies, every time there seems to be a threat.
And what about this rather broad statement that it will be against people who canvass or advocate the overthrow of democracy?
This is where my trouble is. I mean, I agree with almost everything that Margaret says, in the sense that we have to address this issue of terrorism. And much of the law already exists. Our terrorism legislation is one of the most comprehensive in many ways. And in my view, I would argue that it's already stifling open debate about some of the issues that give rise to terrorism. But broadening up, I think that Theresa May's whole essence is that it broadens the debate to include people who, I mean, this notion about obstructing, democracy and so forth. Who are we talking about? I mean, if you speak in the context of Middle Eastern politics, for example, or South Asian politics, many many political parties who may feel that they do not have anything to do with violence, yet maybe paint it as potentially against democracy and so forth. So are we going to ban people simply because they express a view which does not necessarily justify violence, does not necessarily incite hatred and violence? Are we talking about just because they take issue, for example, with the philosophical basis of, say, democracy, are we going to ban them? Are we going to deny them space? I think these are the questions that we need to look at. But for me, fundamentally, the major problem is that this speech fails to address the issue of trust deficit that the Muslim community has in relation to the government. And the rhetoric will only reinforce this idea that terrorist wants to advance, which is that if you're a Muslim, it doesn't matter what kind of Muslim and what your views are, the government will not engage with you unless you completely succumb to their kind of faith. And I think this speech gives further ground to that kind of narrative, and I think that's very unfortunate.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, what about that point, that it will just increase alienation of young Muslims and create, well, not just young ones, but it will just create a sense that the whole community is being somehow penalised?
That's a funny one, because I can't think of any Muslim that I don't respect their right to have a religion that may well be different from mine.
But you're not Theresa May.
So why isn't it coming back the other way? This is what I don't quite understand. And also I do worry that actually is it a resentment against the government in the cases of extremism, or is it simply not listening to the government and listening much more to what they're receiving over the internet? Is it just dismissing the government and not listening, or is it actually someone else's influence? Is that the problem? And in a way, I think the government seems to be saying it's that's the problem, it's not us, and they're now sort of coming in on more of a security tack, having looked at Prevent and seen that Prevent hasn't really done what it should have done as fast as it should have done. I mean, it has had some successes, obviously.
Well, there's a fundamental issue with Prevent. It's pre-crime, as you've mentioned. It's trying to target people before they've done anything wrong. If you're living in a society where you think that your doctor is going to inform on you, your landlord can perhaps come into your home and look at your literature, you're living in a state of fear. And that is what Muslims are coming under. Schools are coming under attack. Prevent are going into schools. Young children, are they being radicalised? I think that is the real issue. The whole Prevent policy, it's highly problematic in that it's criminalising just a state of being. It is thought crimes.
What about the whole issue of giving an alternative message, countering the radical messages with more sensible ones?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way. I think what you need to have is a multi-pronged approach to addressing this problem. And that means you have to empower the community and really go hard on people who are genuinely engaged or has the potential to be engaged in violent extremism. Now, if we mix up violent extremism with, say, for example, religious conservatism, then we're in difficult territory. And two other things that Theresa May talks about is entrism in politics as well as school governance issues. And I thought that was a complete non-starter. It doesn't really help you to gain trust and confidence, which would ultimately empower government strategy, empower the communities to challenge ideas and ideologies that feeds into extremist narrative. Violent extremist narrative. And so for me, really, what should have happened is that instead of announcing policies which are highly rhetorical and very politically driven, what should have happened is that we needed to have a genuine conversation, open, frank conversation with the community, with the government and other stakeholders to see exactly what are the issues, who are the problems here, and how do we go about addressing it. And if we followed that approach, then I think we would have seen much more success than we have seen.
Well, isn't this going back to the 1980s in the way that the IRA was banned and you couldn't have the voice of Gerry Adams on the radio or TV?
Well, I wasn't born in I was born in the 80s, so I couldn't possibly exactly comment how it was. But from what I have read, it certainly feels in that way. But again, we go back to the same point. I mean, you had, for example, recently. It was implied that organizations like Muslim Council of Britain, my own organization, perhaps is a problem. It's, government doesn't want to engage. And yet we have a consistent track record of speaking out against violence and extremism and of all sorts. So when government really problematizes a community just because it probably doesn't toe the line of the government, then it really becomes very problematic and very difficult then to address the issue of alienation, to address the issue of us and them.
Well, Margaret, we've practically run out of time, but what's your reaction to the notion that it's going back to the IRA days when people like Gerry Adams were banned?
I interviewed Gerry Adams and all sorts of people under those circumstances. We were allowed to interview them. They were allowed to say what they wanted. We put an actor's voice over it. I think there's more censorship now by the press, self-censorship, where they're not simply putting on very extreme views. I think actually there's probably more freedom. But then it was a ridiculous thing putting an actor's voice over somebody and then saying exactly the same thing. So I think this is very different. But I think we just need to see where that line is going to be drawn. Has that line, the balance between security and human rights, has that been moved too far to one side, to the side of security?
Well, thank you very much. We'll have to move on now. In other news, Islamic State fighters closing